I'm with Rose Colley, who's a candidate in the senatorial elections, and we're going to talk about her aspirations. Obviously, to get elected, that's the first thing. You're a lawyer.
I am.
And I've noticed that a couple of the hustings, you sort of vaguely apologise for being a lawyer. Why is that, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly because lawyers unfortunately have, I think historically, probably not a very good reputation. And I think that has a psychological effect perhaps on a lot of lawyers. And also, I think in Jersey, lawyers are perhaps too much associated with making money and perhaps not putting enough back into the community. And I don't really mean to apologise, and I think it probably maybe comes out in perhaps the way it's not meant to, but I think they're the reasons why.
There's a bit of a lack of rebel lawyers. There's not a lawyer you'd identify with fighting the poor man's cause in Jersey. Why is that, do you think?
Why is that? I think it's partly because our whole legal system doesn't really benefit, certainly financially, lawyers who are radical, campaigning. Our legal aid system, of course, because it's pro bono, more or less, means that you can't, for example, set up as a legal aid lawyer and get a client following and then use that as a platform. And of course, lawyers, I guess, tend to specialise more and more in different things. So certainly in terms of being a family lawyer, I am probably seen as fairly radical on some issues, but obviously I never do anything like criminal law or employment law or any of those things. But I think it probably is the way our legal aid system is organised, which just means that you don't really attract that client following.
Presumably you had to do your stint as a legal aid lawyer.
I'm still on the tour de role because you have to be on it for 15 years from qualification, and yes, I mean a fair amount of work that I do, particularly childcare work, is under the legal aid rota.
Obviously that does cause financial strains, but you're with a bigger company, so presumably that's how you get support, is it? Because obviously a one-man band
I think one-man bands find it very, very difficult. I think, excuse me, I think most legal aid work can be done by the law firms. I think increasingly, particularly my area, where children are taken into care and their parents often do need and deserve good representation, which often they don't get, is partly a product of our legal aid system, which isn't great.
J.J. Markov, the name I hear when I talk to people, folklore. He was a bit of a hero. Whether it was justified or not, I've no idea. But he was a lawyer, and he was a radical, and he was unusual. He was very often late in court. But have any stories of him come down to you? Are you aware of his existence?
I'm certainly aware of his existence, and I've seen, you know, portraits of him and all the rest of it. And I think not just him, but I think people like Bob Vibert, who obviously founded my firm, were of a radical ilk. They were also political, and I think Jersey perhaps has lost some of that. But of course, you know, this time there are 4 lawyers standing in these elections.
Yes, that in itself is rather unusual, because there's been a bit of a dearth of lawyers in the States for some years. You've had the Markovs being the only one, and as far as elected lawyers are concerned, and even the next bailiff, which is extraordinary. I don't know what thoughts you've got on that.
It is extraordinary. In terms of Philip, personally, I think he has many political skills. I personally still find somewhat unusual the thought of someone who was the bailiff, who also, because of the system we have, was Speaker of the States, now standing as a candidate. And I do find that a bit strange. I think it's alien to my political culture. That's not to say it's necessarily wrong, but I do find it a bit hard to get my head round.
Yes, well, I've campaigned over the years about aspects of the legal system, Jersey legal services. I remember I wrote to Peter Krill many years ago when he was a judge and asked him about the lack of law books. So the general public haven't got much choice. Everywhere you go, consult a lawyer, £300 an hour, consult a lawyer. And for people who earn £10 an hour, it's a huge discouragement. And he wrote back, Peter Krill wrote back, and I can't remember the exact words, but to the effect of, people don't need law books, people know right from wrong. It was such a simplistic response. I thought that was quite a bit absurd, really, wasn't it?
I think it was. I think it was far too simplistic. I think nowadays, of course, with the internet, it's easier. And even in terms of Jersey law, there's obviously been a lot of work done on the Jersey Law information site to make that more available to the public. Unfortunately,
which you've got to pay for now, and I notice now things I could get there for free, and notice the advert said it's much more accessible. When I tried to go on there, nothing's for free at all, so in fact...
Maybe not. I mean, certainly it's been sold to us as lawyers on the basis that it's now more expensive for us because the public have got more access to it, and if that's not correct, then clearly that's something I think that, you know, one does need to know about.
Well, I certainly haven't discovered the free access to it. I was rather disappointed on that. You've been in the legal system to recognise the defects in the system. Have you campaigned within the system for change, within the Law Society? Or?
You mean for change in...
The way the legal services are offered, the lack of... the fact the legal aid scheme is inadequate.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of the legal aid scheme, I mean, I've campaigned... certainly within the profession for years and years. I mean, I chaired the legal aid subcommittee that certainly even got the reform that we have had recently in terms of guidelines being introduced. I think the real problem with our legal aid scheme is, as I've said, there's no financial incentive to do legal aid work, and also people cannot choose a lawyer. So that automatically puts in a form of discrimination. So if you want to go to a particular family lawyer, for example, or a criminal lawyer who might be prepared to do the work, certainly if there was some funding for it from the government, as of course there is in most of the democratic world, you could choose your lawyer, but here you can't. You just get allocated someone, but if you've got the money to pay for it, you can have whoever you want, and that cannot be right.
No, especially since the other side might be represented by a very competent lawyer and you might not have such a competent
and that does happen.
Indeed it does. The requirements to get into the legal system, in other words, if you have rebel people, they can only go in by getting employed in an office. You can't, or at least until now, whether the new system's going to change. That's all seemed rather unfair to me.
Well,
and it's about the monopoly situation which the lawyers have, isn't it?
I don't know if it is. I think it's... I mean, you need to have worked in a law firm for 2 years, but it's really a form of traineeship or apprenticeship. It's no different to if you were a solicitor at the bar in England, where you would need to either serve a pupillage or a traineeship. You couldn't just suddenly become a barrister or a solicitor.
But there are radical firms. There are firms in the UK who are accepted known for their political leanings.
There are, but I mean, certainly my firm, we wouldn't, if the person was right, we wouldn't not have them as a trainee because of their political views.
Do you think that's a generally held belief?
Maybe not, but...
maybe it's changing now, and of course the linkage now, you're not involved with the finance side of the legal profession.
No, I'm not.
But the linkage between finance and law is so oppressive to my view.
I think it probably is. I mean, it's not the work that I do at all. And I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier in terms of that's partly what makes me feel sort of semi-guilty about being a lawyer in Jersey, I think.
But a lawyer who was critical of the finance industry, like for example the other night, it was rather ironic the other night at one of the hustings, a question came up about vulture funds, and every candidate was so much against vulture funds, including the ex-bailiff. Well, I've never heard the ex-bailiff ever make a pronouncement on vulture funds.
No, but
certainly not when he was in a position to do anything about them.
But isn't that one of the problems of the system of hustings, in that you can't have any debate? And of course at a hustings, because you can't test anyone in a debate, people are going to say what they think is the right thing. And of course, if elected, that person may completely forget what they say. And and I think that probably was a good example. I'm not saying that people generally weren't against vulture funds. It was quite interesting that some candidates didn't even know what they were, but there we are.